Hello and welcome to the Ego Chall Podcast. This is episode 59. I am your host, Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. How are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Good. We haven't done a show in like 3 or 4 weeks. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving, and we're about to get into all of the holidays over the next month or so. But the biggest holiday of all is about to come, and that is the beginning of the Call of Duty League season. That was a great segue. Um, and Today we're going to be doing a season preview, kind of looking at the rosters as they are currently constructed and going into the first week of the CDL season. And we're going to also give our predictions on the first week of qualifying matches as well, or seeding matches, however you want to phrase it. Let's just get right into it. Is there a specific team that you want to start off with in terms of their roster?
No, I think we can just rapid fire through this stuff real quick. Just say what the rosters are, and then we can talk about any in particular that you think are noteworthy.
All right.
Um,
I was just going to go alphabetical order then.
sure.
You can go to .esports.com. We have a few roster mania trackers. Bink has been really on top of it about updating all of the roster changes and the announcements and the rumors and whatnot that have come out this off season. You can also go to COD Esports fandom because they're really good about keeping it updated about every roster and the coaches and the subs and whatnot. So wherever you're looking, it'd probably be helpful to follow along if you're into that. But let's start with the Atlanta phase, the runners up at the most recent champs. They finished second pretty much this entire season. And they actually decided to make a roster change, the first one in 2 years, bringing in Slasher in to replace Arcides. Jesus. So it'll be Slasher, Simp, Celium, and Abizi. That'll be their starting lineup, with Classic moving as a sub. And it looks like they have pretty much the same coaching staff as they did last season. I know we've talked about this team in particular before, obviously, when the Slasher Arcides news came out, and we even talked about the possibility of a roster change before that, after the season ended. But now that we're going into the season, what are your overall thoughts on Atlanta phase?
Yeah, I think we're still expected to be top dogs, contenders. S tier, echelon, whatever you want to categorize them as. There's obviously when you make a one person change. Um, and it's in a category like this where RC's for Slasher, both world champions, both main AR, so there's nothing potentially going on there, at least as far as I know, is in like position changes for Celium potentially going to main AR or anything like that. It's a main AR for main AR swap. So pressure is going to be on Slasher to produce with high. He's done it before, but he has arguably three of the best players in the world surrounding him, and he himself is obviously one of the best. But the pressure is still going to be on him after a team that is considered a dynasty in some people's eyes makes a change. The person who is involved in that change obviously has some pressure, and I don't want to say big shoes to fill, but all eyes are going to be on him. I feel like so. I think FaZe will still be successful. It's just going to be interesting to see how they do right out the gate and what their initial look details or how that translates to their results, because we've heard how strict Slasher is with teams that he's on, and his leadership style, all that stuff. So how that works with this team, I think it should be fine, but that's going to be certainly something it'll be difficult to keep track of, but something I'll be interested to see if we hear anything about that going forward.
I agree. I think there are really high expectations for this roster, and right or wrong, Slasher will probably take the brunt of the blame if say that they were not as good, they weren't like one of the top teams right out of the gate. I could see a section of fans just blaming him and saying, look, he's the weak link, you should have kept Arcides, blah blah blah. And I did think that they should have kept Arcides because I'm not in in the team. I'm not day to day with them. I'm not around them to understand what the team dynamic is like, and that's the case for all of these teams. But for FaZe in particular, for them to get second place at all but one of the majors and then get second place at champs, it felt like a mistake to change up that formula, especially with how successful they were the year earlier. But again, I'm not with the team, and maybe the change was very necessary, and this is a good change to have Slasher come in, and maybe that that leadership role, or just a veteran that's been around so many different personalities, so many different players. I think it could help, but that's kind of the beauty of the Call of Duty League season, is we'll get to find out pretty soon, especially with online, how crazy can guys get from playing MW2 online and with these qualifying matches and whatnot. Next team up is the Boston Breach. So they're rocking, a pretty similar roster as from last year. Methods, Nero, Vivid, and Awakening is the starting roster, and then Beans, who is a European player, played in the Challenger scene last year. He is the substitute for the team. We've talked about this team a little bit when the roster change happened. The only real change is Awakening coming into this team. I want to get your thoughts on this, because I think we've both been very high on Big Wake for a while now. I've been very high on Vivid in particular, and this team, I think, overperformed to expectations last season. So what do you think about the Breach going into this season?
Yeah, I'm excited to see the Vivid and Nero connection, how that translates to MW2. We got to see it briefly at the end of the Vanguard season, and it was some of I feel like it was some of the best we've seen Boston. There's some outliers in there probably. So, regardless of the actual results, it felt like they worked well together in very limited time. So I'm excited to see how they play together this year as well. And I'm also looking forward to seeing Vivid and Awakening reunited. I talked about it a couple times now, I feel like, on the podcast in the past, but when they were on Florida together alongside Skies and Dave Patty, it was just Vivid really in the sub world with 3 ARs around him, regardless of what weapons they were actually using. That could cause pacing issues and stuff like that. So now we're seeing, there's a lot of questions about the actual meta in MW2 just because the M4 is so dominant, but taking that out of consideration, it's just going to be interesting to see Vivid and Awakening playing together again with a more traditional composition if we get to a point where it's 2 subs, 2 ARs. We might very well could be in a 6 to 8 M4 meta at this time. So that's just something to keep in mind for some of these rosters. Teams are trying to construct them, keeping the that 2-2 sub AR split in mind. But right now it seems like the meta might be a little AR dominated with the M4 in particular. So will be interesting to see how that affects all the teams in general. Would in my opinion, there's some exciting new quote unquote sub duos that I would like to see in a game where we have 2 subs running around maps. If that's not the case at this point in MW2, we'll just have to see how those players adjust on all the teams across the league. But on this team in particular, if we get to that point, I'm just excited to see the dynamic between Vivid and Nero, as well as Awakening and Vivid reuniting.
I think Boston has a good chance to definitely make playoffs and kind of be in that middle of the road. I don't see this team necessarily as one of the top 3-4 teams, but the ability to crack into that top 4 is always there. We saw it last year, especially I think at the end of like the first stage, the beginning of the second stage, they looked like they were one of the better middle of the road teams, definitely on the higher end. And like you said, if the meta kind of falls in their favor with Big Wake and Methods running ARs, that would be really beneficial because those players are very good and they can, probably work out something very well in their favor. But again, the metas, especially in MW2, if this is going to be a 2-year game for the CDL, things can change pretty rapidly, I'm sure. And with how the game has been being updated, I don't think any players or teams are going to feel real comfortable with the meta for a little bit. But Boston, I'm excited to see if awakening this like change of scenery for him is a good thing, and see how he does away from Skies in that Florida team that he was on last year. Speaking of Florida, though, let's go to the Mutineers. So they are pretty much overhauling their entire roster, only keeping Major Maniac in the starting lineup. Dave Patty is staying on with the team, but he is starting the season off as a substitute. So Major Maniac will be teaming with Havoc, Brack, and Vickle. So Vickle and Brack coming up from the challenger scene. Havoc, he made his way onto the Minnesota Rocket roster last season. And Major Maniac he started the season with the Rocker and then was acquired by the Florida Mutineers later in the season. What do you think about this Florida roster, considering there are 2 Challengers players making their CDL debuts technically?
Yeah, I think don't have a lot of high expectations for this team out of the gate, but Florida has surprised us before in the past. Especially just thinking back to NW 2019, they made pickups of players like Pharaoh and Awakening at the time, which immediately led to results. So could be looking to try to replicate that a little bit here with Brack and Vickle. I don't know much about Vickle, but I am excited for Brack to officially make his debut in the CDL. As you kind of alluded to, he was a part of that 10-man Toronto Ultra squad at the start of the CDL, but never actually got to play for the CDL Toronto team. So this will be his debut, and he was an exciting player before the franchising era at the end of Black Ops 4 with Luminosity. So I'm looking forward to see what Brack can do, and I've always been a fan of Havoc. Back in his days of streaming S&D solo wagers with upside down sunglasses on, and Major Maniac is a player that I think is underappreciated in many aspects, just because he's one of those guys who sort of like Classic, who we talked about just briefly earlier, but he's one of those guys who's going to go out and try to do whatever it takes to win, regardless of if the stat line looks pretty or not. He's going to hold down your spawns and that sort of thing. When he was on Atlanta FaZe, there were multiple games I can remember of him just sitting in the hill and not even like really going for kills because everybody else on the team was killing everybody around him, so he didn't really have to. So he was doing his job, and that's what I would expect him to do on this team too. Although I don't have high expectations for Florida, like I said, they've surprised us in past seasons, and they could do it again. So, a squad that if we were doing power rankings, they would be towards the bottom for me right now. And again, who knows what happens?
Yeah, I don't have particularly high expectations, but I've kind of I trust Ogre 2 to make these rosters. I think he's done a pretty good job over the past few years. And it's obvious that they're not, flush with cash to the point that they're going to be offering these gigantic contracts to anybody that they want. But they've done a good job at discovering talent and utilizing it, even if last season wasn't the best show of form for them. But I like that being said, I don't really have incredibly high expectations. I would say that this team is, if I had to put it, probably bottom 4 heading into the season, just based on my preconception of where these players are in relation to the other teams. But like we saw last season, there are always chances to improve and kind of exceed those expectations. That's kind of what the season's there for. We don't, you don't play Call of Duty on paper, so it could be a good season for Florida, and we'll just have to wait and see. Let's go to the Las Vegas Legion. So this is the first season for the Legion outside of Paris. Obviously, the first 3 seasons, they were the Paris Legion. Now they are the Las Vegas Legion. And the roster has been pretty much overhauled as well. Temp is staying on. He is the only player from last season's roster to make it to this season. And Temp will be joined by Clayster, Prolute, and TJ Haley. And Theory is staying on as the coach for the Legion. Obviously, Vegas is winning champs, but we don't really know how this team is going to compete, because if I remember correctly, last offseason or last preseason, there were people saying, well, don't sleep on Paris. They look pretty good in scrims, blah, blah, blah. And then they had the worst season in CDL history. So I don't know what to take about their they did have some launch weekend success. That doesn't necessarily mean anything in the grand scheme of things, but now I don't know how to feel about that. How do you feel about the Legion heading into this season?
Yeah, a lot of question marks for me. Obviously the big one is going to be Clay just after last year being benched by New York. He finds his way back into the CDL, and now he's got to prove he belongs, which, might not be the best way to put it because he's one of the greatest Call of Duty players in the history. But, at this point, he's getting towards the later stages of his career and his playing days. And as long as he wants to keep competing, he's just got to prove that that's what he's capable of doing and playing at the highest level. So looking for a big year out of Clay if he's able to produce that. And in particular with his leadership, bringing out the best of Bounty Temp, just because he's a super talented player, and I've always enjoyed watching him. And I think Clayster has the potential or the capability to possibly bring the best out of Temp in a situation like this, where although with Clayster on the team, Temp can't be the main AR, which seemed like the position he wanted to be in heading into this season, in a meta such as the one that we're seemingly currently in, that doesn't really matter. And if I'm Temp, I'm trying to learn as much as I can from a guy like Clay in this time that they're teaming together, just because, obviously that's one of the guys you should be looking up to if you're in Temp's position. So I think the Vegas has potential to flip the script on the franchise. It's just going to come down to whether they actually meet those expectations, or are able to produce what the franchise is hoping will be their best season yet.
Yeah, I'm conflicted about it because I think this roster is an improvement over the Paris roster that started last season. But at the same time, I don't see this roster as any better than most of these other teams in the league currently. And that kind of speaks to how talented the league is. I mean, we've had 12 teams. This will be the 4th season with 12 teams, and there's just so much talent that it does make sense that even with someone like Temp, who I think is, like one of the better players in the league despite being on a horrible team last year. And I think he proved it with the stats and just the overall respect that he earned from so many fans and fellow players. And then Clayster, one of the best Call of Duty players of all time. TJ, a really talented player who's kind of had a tough run recently with like the teams and their success. And Prolute, who was given that opportunity with Optic last year, and I think proved that he is capable of being on a CDL roster. Like, that roster doesn't seem half bad, but when you're comparing it and stacking up to the other 11 teams in the league, I don't really see how they're going to stack up like well. I if you compare this team to Atlanta or even compare this team to someone like Minnesota, I would probably pick Minnesota. And I think that's probably not a recipe for success. Obviously, we'll see how it goes, but I'm not feeling incredibly confident about the Legion heading into the season, despite an overall impressive roster. The next roster we should talk about, the London Royal Ravens. This is a pretty interesting team, just from this simple fact that Paul X is making kind of a return. He was very impressive in his very short substitute role with London last season, and then Zero and Nasty representing their home country, and then we have Asim, who is moving from the Los Angeles Guerrillas to the London Royal Ravens, and then Scraps returning to the CDL as a substitute currently. What do you think about this Ravens roster?
Yeah, I haven't heard too many good things about this team yet, but I feel like it was one of the last uh, teams put together. Obviously, Zero, Nasty, Asim, and Paul X with Scraps as the sub. Pretty sure that's been confirmed just by the fact that Scraps is playing in Challengers. But
Mm.
regardless, I think the team has potential. It's just maybe because of how late it was put together, then there might be some questions. I don't really know. Um, the most interesting thing to me, though, is with a guy as talented as Scraps on the bench, it feels like an inevitability that if this team struggles, he will be back in the lineup at some point, as long as he's actually playing well in challengers. Um, so I could see. I know one of the questions we did last year was what team do we think could be the first to make a change, and I can't remember if one of us said London or what, but I feel like this year, just because of that sub situation with a guy like Scrap just seemingly waiting in the wings, I feel like London could potentially be the first team to make a move to get him in the lineup if they struggle out the gate.
Yeah, I definitely think that is a possibility, especially as Scraps gets more comfortable playing competitively again, in a team environment and challengers. Um, I think that's the biggest key right now is that he's been away for a little bit, and while he's hasn't stopped playing Call of Duty, he was mostly playing like Warzone and Blackout before that. He wasn't really focusing on competitive other than maybe a short time frame. So just having a little bit of time to readjust and get back into this kind of team mindset will be interesting to see how long that takes, and if London actually goes that route, maybe they have some success and they decide to stick with it. But a really interesting roster to kind of keep an eye on as the season goes along. Next roster is the Los Angeles Guerrillas. Pretty much the same roster from last season, but swapping out Slasher for Arcides. So we talked about it earlier in the show. Arcides moves from Atlanta FaZe to the Los Angeles Guerrillas, and vice versa for Slasher. Excuse me. So RC, Spart, Neptune, and Hook will be starting. I don't have any real thoughts on this team because Slasher, I felt, was the most impressive player on the Gorillas last season, and they were really bad outside of one tournament. So I don't know how much of a difference Arcides will make. What do you think?
They certainly don't have a lack of talent on this
Yeah.
team. Seeing all of these players shine and have superstar performances individually at the separate moments, it's just gonna come down to what they're able to do collectively as a unit. Um, really looking forward to seeing whether who can step up on this team. Obviously, we know Spart showed some flashes with the Volk when he won MVP Major 2 last year. Neptune kind of had an up and down season. I think he, obviously had the struggles with New York, and then he saw some success in Challengers, got picked back up. So, Neptune has been an exciting player since he made his debut in the CDL in Cold War. Um, but like I said, all these players have the potential. It's just going to be whether they're able to actually put it together and see results as a cohesive unit. At this point, I see them as a middle of a pack squad, but certainly with the potential if they're able to. Last year nobody really expected them to take an event, so this year it could be a similar situation where they're maybe looked at as a middle of the pack team off the rip, but they might turn some heads down the road.
Yeah, there's definitely a possibility. I have really pretty low expectations because I was very disappointed with the team last year and their results. Pretty much, other than stage two, that was definitely the peak, and they it was they had an inside track to make the playoffs, and every chance that they had along the way, they seemed to falter. And maybe Slasher was part of that problem, or I have no idea. But I have very little faith in the team to be one of those top teams just based on last season's results. But it's very possible that we see. The Gorillas with their immense talent kind of take over. I definitely see them as a top four team if they can figure all of that out. But it just I didn't see any of that last season. The other Los Angeles team, the defending world champions, yeah, they were definitely going to make a bunch of roster changes and get rid of everyone. They've decided to bring back everybody. Their coaching staff is the same. The only change to this organization pretty much is the general manager role, with Novus coming in to replace Mud Dog. But as far as the day-to-day, the team aspect of it, nothing has changed. So they have to be in the top 3 or 4 teams in the league heading into this year, just based on how well they finished off last season, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, an interesting aspect we got to keep in mind too is with this current meta that seems to be M4 favored at this point. The Thieves are one of those teams that have that a little extra flexibility in the sense as we've seen Kenny and Draza both run an AR at multiple points. And although the Thieves saw their most success at the end of the year after Kenny switched back to a sub, we know that he is able to be productive as an AR. So this is one of those squads where the M4 heavy meta could favor. I'm not sure how they've been doing in scrims or anything like that, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were just absolutely frying with this current meta, and if all 4 of them are just running around with M4. So um, I wouldn't be surprised if the Thieves pick back up right where they left off. Certainly showed us at the end of last year they had the potential, but once again, early in the season, a lot of teams were expecting them to be that team that they ended up being, but they didn't quite hit that stride until late in the season. So we'll have to see if that's a trend of them starting slow or not, or if they just come out all guns blazing right away.
Yeah, I'm sure Kenny is begging them to let him run a AR, because it's been a trend throughout his career that he's very talented with pretty much any gun that you put in his hands, but he seems to kind of thrive in the sub role, or if there's an actual flex like the Maddox a few years ago, that's something that he excels in. But I'm sure he's probably wanting to have an M4 just based on how things have been going so far this year. The next roster we have is the Minnesota Rocker. Definitely a shakeup with this team. Pretty disappointing end to their year. They lost out on going to champs at the final event, and the only person that stuck around from last season is Attach, and I guess Fame came on later in the season as a substitute. Fame will stick on as a substitute to start this season. But joining Attach in the starting roster for the Rocker will be Bance, Cammy, and Afro. So a little bit of that Toronto Ultra roster from last season. And then Afro coming in from the London Royal Ravens. A pretty interesting roster, in my opinion. What do you think about the Rocker heading into the 2023 season?
Yeah, I'm excited to see a bunch of these guys and a new squad together. I think keeping Attach on Minnesota was extremely important to the organization just from multiple perspectives. But obviously, Attach is one of those guys you can build around both in and out of the actual game because of his personality and his brand. So I think that was a really solid move to make sure they locked him back up. And then surrounding him with guys like Afro Bance and Cammy, I think that's just, obviously it might be a little different for him teaming with Europeans, but I think Attach is easygoing enough where he's one of those guys where it could work especially well just due to the type of person he seems to be. So I think that the Bance pickup might be a little underrated, but putting Afro in a position where he can learn from someone like Bance, who I know we've had this conversation because I said during one of our other episodes that I felt Bance was older than he actually is, and you fact checked it, and he's not as old as I thought he was. But regardless of that, he's been playing for a very long time and is a very successful veteran of the scene. And Afro really hasn't had another sub player. You know, he's played with Zero, who isn't traditionally a sub. Um, but having someone like Bance, who's been in Afro's position, uh, could be beneficial to Afro's development as a player. And we've already seen him make multiple highlight reel plays early in his career. So I'm looking forward to seeing that dynamic. And then we know what Cammy's capable of. He was an MVP candidate last couple of years. I don't think if he actually, no, he wasn't a finalist this past year, but obviously was in Cold War. So I just think the team has potential. I think initially they start out as a middle of the pack team for me, but they certainly have the capability of winning some titles this year. I feel like if everything clicks for them.
Like you said with some of these other teams, as far as the meta goes, having Attach and Cammy running ARs or having the ability to have both of them run ARs seems to be like a pretty appetizing option for Minnesota at this point, because Cammy, like you mentioned, is he's proven to be one of the best players in the league at certain points over the past few years. Attach was by far the best player on a otherwise pretty disappointing team last season. And I think the same could be said for Afro as well on London. That team wasn't very good, especially in the back half of the year, but I think a lot of people have respect and admiration for him and think that he's a really good player. And that's not to leave out Bance, because that wasn't his role. It wasn't his role to get all the kills and be the star player for his team. But I think he's an incredible veteran, the best European player probably of all time, at least like in this modern era. I think this team is good, but it goes back to some of these other rosters that we've already talked about. Do I think that this team is top 4 on paper? Probably not, but that's just a testament more to the talent in the league, not so much this particular team and what I think about them. But I'll probably go with you and say a middle of the road team, but there's definitely a higher ceiling here with Minnesota than there are for some of these other teams. Speaking of a pretty high ceiling, I would imagine, is the New York Subliners. Just based on Hydra and the talent that he has, I think that can raise a lot of ceilings for a lot of teams. So the Subliners are going with Hydra, Kismet, Skies, and Priesta this year, with Wardy, a European Challengers player, coming in as a substitute. A pretty big change to this roster. Hydra and Kismet staying, but Crimsix and Paulex departing after a pretty tumultuous offseason and what sounds like to be a pretty tumultuous regular season as well. But the Subliners were able to squeak into the playoffs, the CDL playoffs last season. And I think everyone agrees that Hydra is really, really talented and definitely someone that you can build a roster around. Skies, at certain points, he's looked like an MVP candidate in the CDL, and Priesta has been a part of some incredible rosters. And Kismet, I think, was really the driving force, or one of them, about New York's turnaround last year. So there's a lot of good things about this Subliners roster. What do you think heading into to this season for NYSL?
Yeah, all the drama from the offseason aside, it's hard to not think about that when trying to evaluate this team, but I feel like there's just a lot of pressure on Hydra, whether we take that into account or not. There were rumors in the offseason, as well as him potentially signing a $500,000 deal or something absolutely ludicrous like that. So obviously we don't know for sure what kind of deal he signed, but even just the thought of that being attached to a player like Hydra should mean that there's a lot of pressure on him to perform.
Mm-hmm.
Seemingly, based on what we heard in the offseason, he was one who wanted to play with a guy like Skies. So again, that puts more pressure on him. Like, hey, if the organization trusts you to go out there and say, hey, I want to play with this guy, if that doesn't work out, it goes back on you, at least in some parts. So I think that he's going to be under the microscope a little bit, in and out of the game, just because of everything that happened in the offseason. But he's obviously shown how talented he is and what he's capable of in the game. And I think this team has potential, but it also has potential to not do well um, as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if they start a little slow, but I also wouldn't be surprised if they start out hot too, just because we know what this team's capable of. Like you said, even with Kismet uh, coming in late in the season and just essentially helping that be a main catalyst of that turnaround for New York was huge. Priesta kind of had a down year last year, I feel like, but he's just always been a guy who is super flexible, can do it all. So this, uh, seeing him shine in an AR role wouldn't be surprising to me at all. Um, yeah, I think there's a lot of question marks around this team, but the potential is there. It's just going to come down to whether it's actually the potential to be, one of those top dogs, or if it's, the other way.
Yeah, I definitely agree, especially on the Hydra point. There were so many rumors about him wanting Skies even during last season to play with Skies. Maybe that'll help. I I think there was some obvious contention between Hydra and Paul and Crimsix, and that dynamic and that kind of contention can lead to these. I don't know what it is. Maybe just bad results or inconsistent results, because they did finish off the season or the regular season strong, but to get to that point they had so many inconsistent and pretty disappointing results that maybe was a result of some of these internal issues. If New York can figure that out, obviously the coaching staff has changed where Revan, as far as I know, Revan and JP are not with NY. I know JP is not, but I think
Revan's
that
the GM of Seattle now.
yeah, that's right. So Revan and JP have departed, and now you just have D-Real, and maybe that. I know some people, and I think very highly of Revan and JP. I think they're really smart guys, and Optic and Seattle are lucky to have them. But I think there might have been too many cooks in the kitchen, if that makes sense, with New York, just because they had three decision makers in like the coaching and the front office. And then you have the players. You have someone like Crimsix, who is very headstrong and very set in his ways about how a team works. And then you have Hydra, who is obviously not jiving with some of these other guys. Maybe just having one clear message or one clear voice from D-Rio, maybe that's something New York needs. That's something that Hydra needs. I'm not sure. I'm very much speculating, but I'm very interested to just see how things work out with the subliners, with this new coaching staff, and with this new roster.
They did sign Sender too from Optic, so Sender is there with D-Rail. Not sure how much of an impact that will have, just because it seemed like Sender was searching. Well, obviously, if you're going to leave Optic, you're going to be in search of a head coaching position. When he was formerly the head coach, then he was a co-coach with Rainbow, or an assistant coach. I don't know the official titles, but if you're stepping down from Optic or release, whatever the technical term is there for his situation, feels like he would be in search for a head coaching position, but then he winds up being in what feels like an assistant coach role with New York. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of impact he's able to have on this team.
Yep. Speaking of Optic, that's our next team: Shotzi, Scump, Dashy, Illy. But this has been a pretty weird offseason for this organization as a whole. You had the whole Dashy and Illy being dropped, and then a day later they're back on the roster. We just mentioned that Sender has left the team, and JP has come in as an analyst for this team. What do you, and not even to mention that Scump has announced his retirement, and that this will be, for all intents and purposes, his final CDL season. So with all that, how do you see Optic going into what should be Scump's last season?
Yeah, I think that's just the big storyline we're going to be keeping track of. They end up running it back with the same squad. And that's the big news, is that Scump is done after this year. He said unless they win every single tournament, and even that didn't seem very convincing as well because he initially didn't said even if they win, he wouldn't come back, and then he kind of flipped the script on that and was saying that he might come back if they win every single one. So. There is a little bit of a glimmer of hope for Optic fans that Scum could potentially play another year beyond this, but for the sake of the argument, we'll just say this is Scump's last year. And that's going to be the main storyline around this Optic team every time they step up to play. Um, every match is a little bit more crucial, I feel like, just because um, you're trying to for the guys playing alongside Scump, you're effectively they might not be thinking about it this way, but they're really trying to help Scump go out on top and further cement his legacy as the greatest Call of Duty player of all time. So it's it's going to be an entertaining season and one that has a lot of eyes on it for that particular reason. Um, but it's also at the same time just one you got to sit back and enjoy the ride if it is in fact his final year. He's been doing this for so long and is just such an electric player to watch. You got to take it all in at the end of the day and enjoy it while you can.
And the Scump piece aside, you have the Illy and Dashy part where, they obviously there was an intention by whoever you want to say, whether it was Shotzi and Scump or whether it was management or coaching, felt like, or everybody involved felt like there needed to be a change. It's interesting that they're going ahead with this roster, and we have the same exact team that we had last season, and this team before Illy's thumb injury was arguably the best team in the league. They had won the first major. They looked very strong heading into the midseason point, and then Illy's thumb starts acting up, and he misses a considerable portion of the second half of the season, and that seemed to derail so much of the momentum that Optic had. And now they're bringing back Illy and Dashy, and I'm wondering if they said that everything's been patched up, that they had this heart to heart. But again, that doesn't mean anything until you face adversity again, because they didn't do anything in the off season. They were just playing different games, practicing with each other, blah, blah, blah. But when you get into matches, say they start losing, maybe they're like 4-2 or 5-3 or something like that. Does that change their perspective? Does that, eventually lead to Dashy and or Illy, probably not Shotzi or Scump, but mostly Dashy or Illy getting the boot? And I think that that's something to keep an eye on, is just whether one of those two players or both of those players will be removed mid-season if things aren't going according to plan. And then we have two final teams, the Seattle Surge, first of all, and then the Toronto Ultra. Starting with the Surge, they didn't make any changes to their roster, didn't make any changes to their coaching staff as far as I could tell, but then except Carson, who was with the CDL last season, he came in as an analyst, and then, as we mentioned, Revan coming in as the general manager. I was not surprised that they didn't make a move, but I felt like if they could make an improvement to this roster, it would probably be in accuracy's position as an AR. What do you think about the Surge heading into the season after by far the best season the Seattle organization has had in the CDL?
Yeah, I think we talked about that enough on other shows that we were saying if Seattle didn't stick with this roster, they could potentially look for a quote unquote upgrade in the AR position, but obviously sticking with accuracy. He has those intangibles, and he's the Iceman. So, with young players like Mac, Pred, and Sib around him, it makes sense to have a veteran leader like Accuracy in the squad leading the troops. So, obviously, they won an event last year, and we saw a lot of great moments from all those guys, whether it was Pred popping off in the hard point on Tuscan or, you know, Accuracy's plethora of ninja diffuses that somehow people keep letting him get away with. Everybody on that squad had highlight reel moments, and this team has a lot of potential. It made sense to me that they decided to stick, especially when you had guys like Sib and Pred on rookie deals. All Seattle really had to do was just extend their contracts, and they're able to have two of the top prospects. You know, they're not technically prospects anymore, but two super talented rookies going into their sophomore years. They're able to keep them on the books. So looking for big things out of Seattle this year. Definitely a squad that has potential to shake things up. And it might not, you know, a lot of people might be looking at like FaZe, Optic, and LAT as like the top teams heading into the year, but Seattle is definitely a squad that could be, you know, in that tier below those squads and pushing into that bracket if they're able to replicate what we saw last year in their best moments.
Yeah, I don't really have too much to add on Seattle. We've talked about it quite a bit at length. And we'll finish up with the Toronto Ultra. They did make some changes in the offseason. Kleenex and Insight staying with the roster, but the Ultra have added Scrappy and Standy. Scrappy was on the Ultra Academy and A roster, and Standy moves from the Minnesota Rocker to the Toronto Ultra. I think overall this team is very intriguing, and a lot of talent is on this roster. What do you think? What do you think the ceiling is for this Toronto Ultra?
I think the ceiling's super high. I'm really excited about this squad. I'm excited about Scrappy getting to make his debut. Uh, you know, in game, he's shown that he's capable of hanging with the best out of the game, and you know, just trash talk and all that stuff is super exciting to me. So I think he's going to be a great addition to the league in multiple facets. I've already said before too, you know, I've sung Kleenex's praises enough at this point, but I'm really excited about Kleenex and Standy as a sub duo. I think they have the potential to work really well together if we get to see them in a meta that's conducive to having both of them on a sub at the same time. And yeah, this has got to be one of the younger teams in the league, even, you know, with guys like, you know, Insight. This is going to be his third year now, but he was essentially a rookie at the start of the Cold War season after coming in for Methods. Kleenex has been around for the whole CDL now, but Standy, this is his third season, which doesn't seem right, but it actually is. Wow.
Yeah.
And obviously Scrappy make it his first, but I still feel like, you know, this feels like a very young squad to me. So there could potentially be some leadership issues that might be something that pops up, but like you said, a lot of talent on this roster, and I'm excited to see what they're able to pull off.
I agree. Definitely one of the more interesting, and I think the ceiling is very high compared to some of these other teams for Toronto. And I think we should also mention before we wrap up this portion of the show, Toronto does not have Marky B as the head coach anymore. So and we didn't mention that he is now the head coach of the Los Angeles Gorillas. And Mayhem, who was, I believe, the Toronto Ultra Academy NA coach, he's also with the Gorillas now, and Flux is now the coach for the Ultra. So maybe these things will affect it. We've talked about before about how much the coaching matters and whatnot, but I think as the longer we get into the CDL, the coaching does seem to have some effect. How much is kind of up for debate, but it'll be interesting to see if Marky B's presence in LAG will benefit them, or how much, and the same with Ultra, how much his departure will affect the team. Now we've got that out of the way. Let's talk about predictions, because you beat me last season, but I'm not going to make it another season, and I think I took too many risks last year. I think I just need to trust my brain and not think about it, or trust my heart, really, because my brain's pretty dumb. But we're going to start with Boston versus Atlanta. So we're going to go through all of these matches. These are the first week of seeding matches, qualifying matches, however you want to phrase it. And we will get to the first major in mid-December, which will be very, very cool, and we'll make predictions for that as well. But let's start off with Boston versus Atlanta, the first match of the season. I'll go first. I'm not going to pick against Atlanta just off the bat. Like, I have to have some compass to follow. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm going with Atlanta too. Before we get further into the predictions, just some background information for our listeners here that obviously the season officially starts on Friday.
Mm-hmm.
These are the qualifying matches, which we saw last year being played online. I think some teams later in the season have announced that they're trying to do like quote unquote homestand type things where they invite their players, their opponents to play either in their local arena or facility or whatever to try to minimize the number of online matches they play. But as far as I know, these initial matches are all being played online, which with MW2 right now we've had issues with custom games. The CDL rules were actually removed from MW2 as a whole for a little bit, which caused certain issues with practice for a period of time here heading into the start of the season. So it feels like an inevitability that some issues could arise with these first initial online matches, but all that aside, that's what if you followed along last year, you should be familiar with this format. I haven't looked too far ahead, but I'm pretty sure at least for this major one, it's only 2 weeks of qualifying matches as opposed to the 3 that we had last year. Major one is also a little different that it is a pro-am, so it's going to be the 12 CDL franchises and 4 top challengers teams playing in a 16-team tournament, which would be separated into group play. Then the top 2 teams in the 4 groups move into winners bracket, other team, loser bracket, that stuff. Or maybe those bottom teams are just eliminated at the bat. I actually don't know too much about the format beyond the group play with the 16 teams, but regardless of that, major one is just a little different in that regard, and I just wanted to throw that basic information out for listeners before we fully dive into the predictions.
No, that's definitely good. Like you said, this one is 2 weeks. We're typically used to the 3 weeks, and I think that's what's going to happen for everything but this one, if I'm not mistaken. So for the major one seeding matches, there will only be 4 matches per team instead of the 5 that we're used to, so 1 fewer per team, which makes sense because usually teams would play 2 matches 1 week, 2 matches another week, and then that final week would be 1 match. So not getting that 1 match week now. So getting back to the predictions, we both picked Atlanta over Boston. Optic versus Minnesota. I think I have to go with Optic. I think pretty highly of the team. I'm a little intrigued and a little worried about maybe their long-term future with the roster, but I think Optic over Minnesota is the right play here.
Yeah, going with Optic too.
The Vegas Legion versus the Los Angeles Thieves. I think this is a bad matchup for Vegas in their first match out of Paris. So I'm going to go with LAT.
Me too.
LAG versus Seattle, probably the match of the day as far as the matchups. I'm not really sure what to expect out of LAG. I'll go with Seattle. I was not very kind to LAG when we were previewing the rosters, so I don't think it makes sense for me to pick against them.
Yep, I'm sticking with Seattle here too.
Saturday, December 3rd, Minnesota versus Toronto, the Battle of the North or whatever they call it. I'm going to go with Minnesota on this one. I think they're a pretty I like the roster, and both of these teams are relatively new, some changes. Maybe this will be a standy revenge game and I'll be eating my words, but what do you think about this?
Yep, I'm going with Toronto here. Really high on that squad, as we were just saying at the end of our preview section, so I'm going to pick them in Scrappy's full-time starting debut CDL.
Next match, New York Subliners versus London Royal Ravens. I'm going to go with New York. I'm not really sure what to expect with London, and I don't really have very high expectations for them.
Right there with you.
Seattle versus Boston. I kind of want to pick Boston because they're like the new Florida, and I really picked Florida a lot over the past few years, but I think I have to pick Seattle at least through the first week or 2.
Yep, I'm going to go with Seattle too, and remember we did the same thing last year where we were high on Seattle. They started out, I think, a little bit okay.
Like 5-0 or something, or 3-0.
And they went on like a 7-game losing streak or something at one point. I don't even remember the timeline. It all blurs together, but I just remember we were picking Seattle a lot when they were losing a lot. So we could get screwed here, but I think Seattle will pull this one off too.
And conversely, we were picking London to lose a lot, and they were winning a lot, and then it flipped again. The final match on Saturday, Florida versus Vegas. Why don't you go first? Who do you got between them?
Vegas is winning champs, baby.
All right, I'm going with Florida. I need to make sure that we're balanced. I don't want to tip over the bandwagon for Vegas. LA, and then we'll have the final few matches on Sunday. First of all, we have LAG versus London. I don't like either of these teams. Who do you got?
I'm going LAG.
All right, I'm gonna go LAG. I can't fall behind, and I'm thinking about it now, which I probably shouldn't be. But if I pick Florida against Vegas and you're picking Vegas, I probably need to stick when I'm not sure. Optic versus Florida, I'm going to go with Optic. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to pick against them. Atlanta versus LAT, a rematch of the Call of Duty Championship from last season. A little bit different now that Atlanta has Slasher, a former LAT member. I'm going to go with LAT, and I have no idea why.
I mean, they beat them enough at the end of last year. They should have momentum on their side. I'm going with Atlanta, though.
Yeah.
William trust.
And the final match of the week, Toronto versus New York. Who do you got?
I'm going with Toronto.
Yeah, I probably should pick Toronto. I'll go with Ultra. Definitely a tough matchup for on paper at least. I don't know what happened. Maybe Toronto a 50-point club, New York, but to me it just seems that this would be a tough matchup on paper. But
I could see this one going either way. I said earlier in our preview how excited I am for Toronto, so I'm picking them to go 2-0, but I probably shouldn't trust Canadian franchises, and I might be let down. We'll just have to see.
Well, we will get out of your hair then about the Canadian franchises. I don't know what the Ultra did to you. They've only given your new favorite player a chance at the CDL, but that is our predictions. We do that pretty much every show during the season. We'll keep you updated on who's leading and whatnot. I think Bink might have beaten me by 3 or 4 matches last season. It was pretty close. What? Was it not that close? It felt pretty close.
I don't think it was at the end.
All right, maybe Champs got out of hand, but I was definitely within a few matches heading into Champs. And
the Champs recap was episode 53.
Yeah.
So it was 7. I went 116 and 80. You went 109 and 87.
See, all 7 of those matches were definitely London matches, I feel like. Because I was really on the bandwagon, and that bandwagon broke down so many times during the year. And they're pretty much the only reason that I lost you, I think.
I think that's pretty. One of the reasons I was excited to do. Obviously, I missed doing the pick'em with Mike and the guys. All having it in one doc, but I think having it with just us and being able to look back at that specific number as record wise is pretty cool, and we'll be able to use that in multiple ways. Hopefully doing this for years to come. Looking at maybe the potential of the difference in the number of matches, because obviously 116 and 80, that's just under 200 matches, 196 I believe. I don't think we did for all the
that's not including the pro-am and
that's what I was, the pro-am and the kickoff and stuff like that. So we didn't do it for all of the actual, well, I don't want to say actual tournament. We didn't do it for all the tournaments on the schedule as in depth as we do for the actual majors and champs and stuff. But still a good gauge of the amount of matches that are played throughout the year, and obviously that was the first year we've done that. So 116 will be the number to beat for anyone going forward.
Yeah, definitely something that we'll keep track of as the season goes along, and hopefully we'll both beat 116, and I'll beat you by at least 1. That would be nice. Is there anything else that you want to talk about before we get out of here?
Not really. I think
you're loving MW2, as I can imagine. Everybody's loving MW2, even especially the pros. They're very high on this game.
Yeah. Nah, I mean, it's no secret that there are a lot of issues with the game that need to be addressed, and until we actually get some fixes. It could be a bumpy start to the season, but um, we've had some unfavorable games the last couple of years, and I still firmly believe, even though you have um, guys like, or not guys, but games like Vanguard that were very coin flippy in nature and stuff like that, and just all the games in recent years have been questionable, and certain elements have been heavily scrutinized. But at the end of the day, the pros still did a really good job of uh, producing quality content and making the competitive aspect of the game as entertaining as they possibly can. So I think we should hopefully have another exciting year in store for the CDL, as exciting as possible with this game until we get some fixes. And I'm just hoping, and at least initially from the start here, that there aren't too many bugs and glitches and whatnot that hamper the potential success of the season. Because I do think we do have to just bring up too that this is the earliest start date uh, in the young history of the CDL, which is something that we and the community have talked about at length, is just trying to start the actual competitive season closer to the launch of the game to capitalize on that hype. It's still not, immediately after the launch, and one thing we've talked about too is I don't know if we'll ever get to that point where it's like, season starts a week after the game drops. That just doesn't uh, make sense until we get to the point where the pros are actually being sent to test the game extensively before it officially drops. But all that spiel aside, I'm looking forward to the season and just hoping for the best.
Me too. I think pretty much every Call of Duty League season, and before that CWL, and before that MLG, and all those seasons that we had, I feel like in one way or another they are typically entertaining, even if the game itself is not that entertaining. For example, I hated Infinite Warfare. I never played it, and I watched a lot of it, and I didn't like the game. I didn't like the style of the game, but the matches were always pretty entertaining and, really hotly contested. And I think at the end of the day, that's usually what it's all about, is about the competition and not so much the game. Although the game definitely should be good, because that helps so many other things outside of that. And I'm not even just talking about viewership, but just like everybody playing it and being interested in it. But you gotta be realistic, and that's probably not going to happen, at least immediately, and definitely not going to happen without the input of the pros and the influencers that have a vested interest in the competitive scene. But again, I think it'll be a good CDL season. I think this format is this will be like the first season that the CDL is kind of rolling with the same format as the previous year, even with like a slight change with the first major being the Pro-Am. That really isn't a big change, and I think it's really just a positive change, if anything. So I think it'll be great, and I'm really happy that the CDL is back, because it gives me something to talk about, to think about, to talk about now, and in the podcast. But yeah, that does it for me. That does it for Bink. Make sure to subscribe or like our podcast, whatever platform you're listening or watching on. We're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating, a thumbs up, whatever, to make sure that you're supporting us however you can, or wherever you can. Follow us on Twitter. He's at jbink with 2Ks. I'm at Preston Byers, and the podcast Twitter is at Ego Chall Podcast. The next show will be sometime next week. We don't really have like a set day, but it'll be earlier in the week, maybe Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday-ish. And we'll be talking about how the first week of matches went, if there were any 3.5-hour delays that we need to talk about and break down. And we'll also be talking about the second week of qualifying matches and giving our predictions and whatnot about those matches. But yeah, that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yep. Thank you guys, as always, for tuning in. I know this offseason felt a little weird, in my opinion, just in the sense we didn't have as many shows, and we had multiple week-long breaks in between episodes. But with the season officially starting this Friday, this should be the start of us, getting back in the routine of regularly producing these podcast episodes based on actually having season matches and stuff to talk about. So I'm looking forward to the upcoming season. Hope you guys are too, and hope you guys are looking forward to another year of the Ego Chall breaking everything down and giving you all your CDL needs in that regard. So thank you guys, as always, for tuning in, and remember to send the chow.